So what's the mechanism of action? Increased blood flow, increasing oxygen and nutrients to all parts of the body, including the brain. Exercise is anti-inflammatory. When I see patients with asthma and allergies, particularly patients with asthma, one of the most helpful things is, of course, getting their asthma under good control and identifying asthma triggers. But physical activity actually makes their asthma flare up less. So it has anti-inflammatory properties. Are you guys familiar? There was a pretty famous study that ended up in the newspapers that took adults. This was maybe in the early, it's got to be about 10 to 15 years old. They randomized adults with mild to moderate depression into two groups. One group got on the treadmill for 30 minutes 3 times a week. The other group got an antidepressant medication. At the end of 12 weeks, they had the same response rate in terms of improved mood. So physical activity, powerful intervention for shutting off inflammation, for improving mood. It's been shown to alter brain chemistry. It's been shown to improve sleep. And then there's more and more research that's actually trying to link certain kinds of physical activity with outcomes. You guys may be familiar, but yoga has really gone way mainstream. I mean, there are really a number of good studies that have demonstrated that this is a wonderful way to address a number of chronic inflammatory conditions. And what it does in terms of moods is, again, it's sort of mindfulness, it's stress reduction, it's requiring the person to really focus on their body and their body movements so they're not thinking about the other stuff that yanks their moods around, their old stories. So it can be very helpful. And then recreation and relaxation. Hobbies such as music, art, and actually I shouldn't say hobbies, I should say art therapy, music therapy. They're actually therapeutic interventions that are specifically designed for healing purposes. So it's not just dabbling, but even being able to access programs that are designed to address health issues and mood disorders. It can be extremely powerful. Quiet, unstructured time. Do you guys remember that? When was the last time, we as adults got to experience that? But this is critical for brain recovery. One of the most powerful ways of allowing humans to tap into creativity and insight and wisdom is to actually be allowed to be bored. But not bored to the point where you then go off and get in trouble, but bored with access and maybe role modeling and some ability to begin to engage the world in a creative way. And so, there are lots of people who are beginning to write about this and what's the role of having quiet, unstructured time in terms of its effect on mood. Stuart Brown is a pediatrician from Stanford who wrote a book called Play, How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul. A lot of his research that he quotes is really based on animal studies. And here's a really interesting thing. I heard him speak at the University of Minnesota, in the last year. And he talked about how one of the types of play that has been demonstrated to be really beneficial in terms of social and emotional functioning in humans is allowing toddlers, and this is a little counterintuitive, but allowing toddlers to engage in rough and tumble play, allowing them to sort of play with each other and maybe get into kind of rougher play, but then learn how to resolve it and learn how to respond if somebody accidentally gets hurt. Not to stop the play, but to have them obviously not, making sure that they're not in danger. But children at that age, it allows them to develop empathy, to be able to recognize limits about what they can and can't do before it affects the other adversely. All sorts of kinds of learning come from that. And we kind of jump to extremes as a culture. When we realize there's too much violence in the world, we think, we have to stop violence in every form, including rough and tumble play. And no, kids aren't allowed to do that because that's just going to lead to fighting. And we forget that there's some of those behaviors that are normal and natural that may actually support good brain development, good emotional and behavioral self-regulation, or create the natural opportunities to develop those skills. So that's what he talks about in that book. And then Richard Louv, you guys may have already heard of. He's the guy who wrote the book Last Child in the Woods and the Nature Principle. He's the one who coined, actually he coined it in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, the term nature deficit disorder. I don't know if you guys heard this. It was picked up by the press, and they were running around and saying, oh, there's a new diagnosis in DSM-4. It's called, or DSM-5. It's called nature deficit disorder. And he really said it almost as a joke. But he was truly interested in the healing effects of being out in nature for some of the young people that we work with who have a fair amount of emotional dysregulation. Now, here's the piece I really do want to emphasize. No one intervention is obviously going to be the right answer for all kids with a particular diagnosis. To some extent, we have to step away from looking for the one magic bullet. And we need to look at who are our young people, who's the person in front of me, what is the family context, the school and local community context, the cultural context that they live in, and what might they be interested in that is a creative form of allowing them to engage in recreational activities. We get into difficulties when we say, oh my gosh, it's all about being in nature. Now you take that anxious child who, you know, a cricket sends them, just hearing a cricket once sends them into a panic, and you put them in the woods? No, that's not using our common sense and wisdom. So obviously we have to think critically about what makes sense. But we want to think about what are activities that take that child out of their anxiety, out of their depressive thinking, and engage them in a way that's meaningful for them. And being willing to have a variety, a smorgasbord, if you will, and offering, and maybe even having the adolescent or the child direct which activity they want. Gee, there are, you know, a handful of things that have been shown to help in, you know, in stress reduction. Which of these would you be interested in tapping into? So starting with that young person, we don't even think about that. We say, what is the evidence? And you know, the evidence is important, but it's showing an effect at the population level, and it's not telling you about the individual. So we have to remember, in the end, we have to go to the individual and understand what are the needs of this young person in front of me. And then relaxation techniques. This mindfulness-based training, I've become more and more interested in because there's really just fascinating research. Gosh, I always forget the name of the center, but if you're interested in the research, there's really fascinating neurobiological research on the effects of mindfulness training on the human brain in adults. That's coming out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the researcher is Richard Davidson. And he's the guy who convinced the Dalai Lama to force his monks to leave their quiet monasteries in northern India and come to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and get hooked up to functional MRI machines to see what kinds of intellectual tasks they were capable of, to kind of describe what does a brain look like when you're really good at controlling your thoughts and you're really good at not getting lost in stress-based thinking. So he documented that, and that's wonderful. But most of us don't have 20 to 30 years to be able to go off and practice mindfulness in a monastery, so what about the rest of us? And so the next level of research was he then took adult volunteers in Madison and taught them some mindfulness exercises. I believe it was a couple of hours a week, once a week, anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks. Did MRI or functional MRI scans of their brains before and after. And let me go back to the monks. What the most fascinating results that they found, which they thought were artifact initially, they didn't believe it, was these monks had incredible pooling of blood flow in their left prefrontal cortex. The blood flow just seemed to really want to hang out there. And that really is a reflection of us accessing prefrontal cortical, the highest cognitive functioning, you know, that we'd love to all be living from that place all the time. So that's what they were looking for in the adult volunteers. And what they found was after 12 weeks, everybody increased their baseline prefrontal cortical blood flow just after 12 weeks of practice. And then they followed them 3 months later and found that some of those effects still persisted. And it was dose response related. The more you did it, the more you practiced over time, the more the blood flow hung out here. Now, what does that look like functionally? With the monks, they were able to be given a random string of numbers, and they were then able to recall those numbers back way more accurately than most of us would be able to in the room. And that's a reflection of being able to be in the present moment and absolutely absorb new information, clearly store it and retrieve it right after. So that kind of functioning improved. And where Dr. Davidson and his researchers went after that is they started tracking, okay, so that's function. You know, people seem to have better concentrating abilities, but they started finding results that are really stunning, namely that over time, practitioners showed shrinking of the volume of their amygdala. So that's the fear response part of the brain, and expansion of the volume of their hippocampus, which is where we store memory. So this mental activity in adults, when it was practiced in adults, was changing the structure of the brain. Talk about brain plasticity. I mean, it's extraordinary. Those of us in child and adolescent care, we're always it's always emphasized about windows of opportunity and critical time periods where we need to intervene, otherwise there's not a whole lot of good that can happen. Well, when you look at the adult world and adult research, it's clear that the brain stays plastic till the very last day. I mean, it's such a hopeful message. There's so much that can be done, no matter what the age is, no matter what the deficit is, there's room for improvement. And that, to me, is a really important message, because it's easy for us to get heavy-hearted and say, well, my patient has bipolar disorder. They're never going to be able to settle down. Or my patient has X, Y, and Z. You know, this is always going to be hard for them. No matter who they are, learning these self-regulation strategies, no matter where their baseline is going to improve baseline and give them greater quality of life. Okay, so now we're getting to the meat of the talk. This is really the area. Oh, actually, boy, that was a Freudian slip. That's interesting. Okay, because it's all about fruits and vegetables. Yeah, I love that. Okay, whoa. Look at how I've been acculturated. Now we're going to get to the kale of the talk. Because kale, as you guys know, is a superfood. It's kind of amazing. It gives us everything we need, and there are ways to dress it up so it doesn't taste like kale. So that's what we're going to talk about. So what's the problem? I really, until I went off and kind of really delved into the popular culture and read Michael Pollan's books, Omnivore's Dilemma, and a couple of his other books, and then, it's just amazing. There's been such an explosion of documentaries and studies about food and the food system and where we've gone wrong in terms of optimizing our nutrition or trying to feed ourselves. So there's a lot of good information out there. And what I want to share with you is my best understanding of the science of it. So the bottom line is, in the United States, as I mentioned this morning, we're no longer eating foods that nourish our bodies adequately. And there's an innocence behind the story. I mean, it really was an attempt on the part of the food industry to try to make foods easier to prepare and free up women from the kitchens in the 1950s and the TV dinners. The intention was good, but what we didn't understand then, however, what we understand very well now, is all of those processed foods are not nutritious for us. And even the ones that then have the vitamins and minerals added back, it is not the same as eating the whole food in its natural state. Because guess what? No matter how smart we think we are, we cannot improve on millions of years of evolution. Nature figured out and allowed to survive in the environment those foods that were the most nutritious for the animals that were eating them, and then we come along with food science and we think we can improve. It's sort of like the story of us trying to improve on breast milk, you know, in the last century. I'll make it be in last century kind of problem, but you know, and thinking better living through chemistry, and if we could understand what are the nutrients of breast milk, we can artificially create it, and that's going to be better for the baby. No, now we know breast milk is optimal. And so it's really that same idea. When we're lucky enough to have the choice and the availability, whole foods is really what our cells are designed to nourish them optimally. Again, the processed foods, they have the micronutrients leached out of them. Putting them back or taking a vitamin in eating processed foods is not the same, because the whole foods in and of themselves probably have so many other chemicals and components that we haven't even studied. And even if we studied, we wouldn't understand all the synergistic interactions between all of those components that make them optimally absorbed by our bodies, utilized by our bodies. And so that's why in the end your grandmother was right. Eat your fruits and vegetables. I mean, or your great grandmother in some cases, because your grandmother probably was using the TV dinners and all of that, or some of you. So that's number one. Number two, we're more and more developing problems with digestion of certain foods that are causing an inflammatory response. And these are foods that we've digested well for 10,000 years. And only in the last 50, 60 years, we've begun to recognize that a growing number of the population is developing an inflammatory reaction to foods that have been in our diet for a really long time. And nobody fully understands why this is emerging, but to some extent, we think it has to do with the amount of antibiotics that have made it into our food supply. It's not even doctors writing prescriptions for antibiotics too much, although we've done that for a long time, and physicians are being taught to pull back and not treat viral illnesses with antibiotics. So we're trying to change the culture there. But what we do know is, in terms of the amount of antibiotics used in our culture, it's tenfold greater use. There is a tenfold greater use in the animal industry, in the agribusiness industry, the antibiotics that are put into the feed of animals. And those antibiotics make it into our systems. And what we're now understanding is our natural good bacteria in our intestines have been disrupted by all of that antibiotic exposure. So we're not adequately digesting the food we eat because we don't have the digestive power that we used to. There's a huge area in medicine now in gastroenterology that's studying what we call gut flora, or what the healthy bacteria in our intestines and what that ought to look like. And it's being connected with all sorts of imbalances in the intestinal flora are being linked with all sorts of health issues. And so that's part of what's happened. And we'll talk about what are those foods, and then what can we do to kind of identify that, and then adjust the diet accordingly. And then finally, we're recognizing that inflamed bodies, so anything that triggers the inflammatory response in the body, is going to release what we call inflammatory chemicals, or pro-inflammatory cytokines. That just means inflammatory chemicals into our bloodstream that then circulate and flare up inflammation all over the place. And so, for example, we've known in pediatrics forever that eczema and asthma seem to go hand in hand. Eczema, asthma, and allergies all are inflammatory responses, but we've never really sort of explained why, until there was a study that was done, or some studies in the recent past, that demonstrated that about 40% of kids with asthma and allergies actually were sensitive to milk, to dairy products. And when you took dairy products out of their diet, the asthma and allergies went away. And so that was one of many sort of studies that have begun to show that for some inflammatory conditions, it may be dietarily related. Furthermore, just because there's inflammation happening in the intestines, it doesn't mean it stays in the intestines. Those chemicals get released and they're picked up by the bloodstream and they circulate everywhere. So they go to the lungs and they go to the skin and they go to the liver and the kidney and they can go to the nervous system. And so you can actually have nervous system or neuroinflammation, and in some patients that'll manifest as anxiety or depression. So I'll tell you a typical presentation of a patient. I've had 15-year-old patient, come to clinic, and turns out that she's there because her anxiety has gotten really bad to the point where she's having difficulty concentrating on her schoolwork. And she's an A student, maybe she gets a couple of Bs, and it turns out that she's not as efficient with getting her schoolwork done because it's really hard to concentrate. So it's taking longer and longer at night for her to get her work done. And when she does finally go to sleep, it's really hard to fall asleep because her thoughts are racing and she's worried about her school performance and a whole bunch of other things. She wakes up in the morning just in time to get the bus. Of course, she's skipping breakfast, so she's micronutrient deficient. And then, she gets to school, she's eating the school lunch, so it's processed foods. She has some after-school activity, so she gets home, she's not eating with the family, she's kind of pulling together what she can on her own, and that's her every day. And then I broaden the history taking, and I find out, she's been otherwise fairly well except for a few things. She had reflux as a baby, and her mom had to switch her from cow's milk formula to soy or some other formula. She had a little bit of eczema when she was 1 or 2 years old. When she was 5, she developed asthma. When she started menstruating, she developed painful periods, so what we call dysmenorrhea. And then, she's had headaches. She had headaches in elementary school, but now they're migraine headaches. But she's really here for anxiety, so can she get her anxiety medication? And I look at that story and I say, is she somebody who's extraordinarily unlucky and she has 7 different health conditions? Or is this all a reflection of some underlying fundamental imbalance that we haven't figured out yet that keeps manifesting in these other organ systems because it never gets shut off? And the most common story I'll find is that it's going to be a food intolerance. And I'll walk you through, like, how do you figure that out and what do you do about it? And I can't tell you how many times I've had a patient with that story, with the backstory, the other health issues. We do what's called a comprehensive elimination diet, try to figure out what's kicking up her system. We pull out that food, and not only does the anxiety go away, the migraines stop happening, the dysmenorrhea goes away, the asthma's under good control, the eczema clears up. So obviously it's, in that case, and I'm not saying, now I want to be really clear, I'm not saying that anxiety is due to milk protein intolerance. I hope you guys didn't hear that. What I'm saying is we have the manifestation of imbalances and we call them disorders, and we have ways of describing them. But what got you there may be very different from patient to patient. And so what got you there may require a different treatment strategy, or at least exploring different treatment strategies. That's why the one diagnosis, one pill probably doesn't work very well for very many health conditions. And we really have to get more comprehensive and holistic about the way we understand what's going on. We have to gather better information and explore what else could be contributing. Okay, so as I mentioned, the standard American diet. So actually, I've covered a lot of this already. The processed and refined foods, they're really not optimal food. Oh, please.
I just wanted to ask about, because you mentioned the antibiotics, but what about the genetic changing that they have done to our other things like wheat and other vegetables or soy? And, they're changing them genetically, which is being allowed in our country.
That's my next slide. Yeah. So no. I'm teasing. I love that you went there because there's really a way to think about it. Why that can be a little bit of a problem. So if you don't mind me holding off, and I'll get to it. So thank you. That was perfect. So as I talked about, the processed foods, they're micronutrient poor. They're high in calories because they still have, remember, the carbohydrate, the protein, and the fat, and they come into our system. We don't have the micronutrients to actually convert those substances into energy, so they just get stored. Processed foods are high in gluten, casein, and whey, which are the milk proteins that are most commonly implicated when people have a dairy problem. It's not lactose. That's why Lactaid and taking Lactaid pills doesn't solve the problem. More often than not, if somebody has a problem with multiple symptoms around dairy, it's a milk protein problem, and you have to take out all dairy. Really hard. We all love our cheese. I have very sad adolescents when I share that information with them, but we brainstorm how to live around that if that's the issue. The processed foods also have high fructose corn syrup, and the deal with high fructose corn syrup and sugar and refined sugars, they don't cause inflammation, but once inflammation's there, they fuel inflammation. And the analogy I like to give to my patients and families is it's sort of like if you had a bonfire going. No, let's say you had dried wood and you poured gasoline on dried wood. It wouldn't catch fire. It wouldn't do anything. That's like the sugar in the body. But if you already had inflammation going, so a little bit of a bonfire going, and then you poured gasoline, it would flare it up and keep it going. So that's why sugar and refined sugars are particularly harmful for people who already have chronic inflammation going on in their bodies. So the solution, of course, is lots of colorful vegetables and fruits. These have the chemicals that are what we call phytonutrients, that just means plant-based nutrients, that keep our cells working optimally. We were evolutionarily designed to need all of those vitamins and minerals to make all the enzymes that our cells have work. And without them, the enzymes don't work. So, of course, lean protein is critical. Some whole grains, there are people who don't have a problem with gluten, in which case being gluten-free is not going to give you any health benefit. But we're realizing that the extreme form of gluten sensitivity, namely celiac disease, is thankfully still a fairly rare condition, and it's an autoimmune disease. But there is a growing number of people who don't have celiac disease. They go to their doctor, they get the test for celiac disease, it comes back negative, and the doctor says, oh, you don't have celiac disease, you can eat gluten. And yet that individual notices when they have a lot of gluten, they don't feel well. Well, ignore your doctor, listen to your body, and take gluten out of your diet. If you notice that you feel better without it, just because you don't have the autoimmune version of it, it doesn't mean that it's not causing some sort of inflammatory response. The difference is autoimmune disease causes produces antibodies, which we measure in the blood. There are other forms of immune reaction, other chemicals that get produced that we don't measure by our standardized testing that are going on, that are causing disruption in the body. And that's why physicians say, oh, you're fine because our tests are negative. The truth of the matter is we haven't developed the test to really pick up those other inflammatory chemicals. And we're headed there, but we're not there yet. So healthy fats are critical. Fish oil, avocado, fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, critical for brain, critical for every cell in your body, powerful anti-inflammatory. The story is okay, now we're going to go back to 6th grade biology. Do you guys remember way back we talked about the cell membrane as being a biphospholipid layer? Ring a bell? Okay. Okay, nerd biology. Of course, I remember that. But okay. Biphospholipid layers. So basically, you've got 2 phosphate heads and then these squiggly lines that are essential fatty acids, and that forms the cell membrane. The cell membrane around every cell is critical because that's where you have cell receptors that are communicating with every other cell and every other system in the body. So it's all about information coming into the cells correct information to make the cells work and do what they need to do, absorb nutrition, get rid of toxins, etc. Now, the squiggly arms, that point in the middle from the phosphate heads are fatty acids, essential fatty acids. And they're made up, and ideally they should be made up of omega-3 fatty acids. And we need a diet rich in that, so all our cell membranes are formed properly. If our diets are rich in omega-6 fatty acids, those are stiff, they don't read signals as well. That's the diet very high in fats and red meat, like very high in red meat. That's why those kinds of diets are associated with greater inflammation. What we do know, though, is red meat didn't always used to be a problem. When cows were eating grass, they actually had essential fatty acid content in the meat. But when we started forcing cows to eat grain, which is not naturally what they should be eating, it increased the amount of omega-6 fatty acid production in their bodies, and that's when the meat became inflammatory to us. And then anti-inflammatory spices. There are all sorts of spices that we can cook with. Cinnamon. So my favorite thing to recommend to an adolescent to improve their breakfast scenario, once their sleep is regulated and they can actually generate some hunger in the morning, oatmeal with walnuts and dried cherries and a good sprinkling or two of cinnamon. Fantastic source of protein, the walnuts, the slow and steady release of sugar from the complex carbohydrate, the oatmeal. The cinnamon is known to stabilize blood sugar, so there's not a lot of spiking, as opposed to the Pop-Tart that gives a flood of sugar, spiking of insulin, then a crashing. So the insulin gets spiked. Insulin drives sugar back into the cells, and then all that sugar is pulled out of the bloodstream, and then you get a crash and hypoglycemia, and then the carbohydrate craving. And that's really bad for brain functioning to go up and down like that. So phytonutrients, getting to the GMO issue. Plants are really smart. They have evolved a way to survive in times of danger that do not involve, obviously, fighting, fleeing, or freezing, because they're sedentary. So how do they protect themselves from the environment? They produce chemicals that fight against their threats to survival. So antibacterials, antivirals, antioxidants to protect against wind and drought and sun and pests. And those chemicals protect them and allow them to survive, but they also allow us to get those same health benefits when we eat them. So that's what phytonutrients are. We improve our body's functioning by eating those naturally occurring chemicals. What's wrong with GMO? Genetically modified plants are designed to not have stress. Those molecules are only produced when the plant is stressed. So then what we're eating are plants that have lower levels of all of these beneficial phytonutrients, because as the food scientists thought it would be better for the plant to be hardy on a genetic level, but they've only changed it against one threat, and it throws the natural properties of the plant out of balance, and it's not as nutritious for us. So foods in their natural state and the wild type are much more healthy for us. These chemicals help us get rid of environmental toxins, and they promote healthy cell signaling for all the reasons that we talked about. And we already talked about how there are two chemical reactions in the body, two main chemical reactions. Either we're in stress mode, activity mode, fighting infection, fighting, fleeing, or freezing, out in the world, engaging, stress response, sympathetic tone. That's one arm. The other arm is quiet, healing, repair, growth. And we're constantly competing. So if we're constantly in inflammatory mode, then we're not healing and we're not doing the repair. So these are just slides to give you things to talk about when you're trying to talk about what's so amazing about fruits and vegetables. So the different colors, the different types of foods that fall into those colors. I sometimes throw in the scientific names if I have an adolescent who really loves the science stuff and I want to give them that information. So what I'd like to do now is shift to this idea of hidden food intolerances. And the reason why we call them food intolerances is they're not food allergies. Food allergies very specifically trigger a certain kind of inflammatory response. All of us can picture the person with a peanut allergy where they get a little peanut oil on their lip and their lip blows up and it's hard to breathe, like very, very sensitive, immediate inflammatory response. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a low level, again, pro-inflammatory cytokine release. Cytokine just means chemical that has activity. But basically, that low level part of the inflammatory response that is slowly and quietly throwing different systems out of balance. And so the typical story is the one that I already gave you. You know, there might be early history of colic or feeding problems or reflux as an infant, frequent infections that were treated with antibiotics. That may or may not be part of the story of the individual, where the antibiotics accidentally not only killed off the bad bacteria, the ear infection or the sinus or the lung infection, but also with enough antibiotic exposures killed off the good bacteria in the intestines, in which case, how do you protect against this? If you have a bacterial infection, you need to get treated with antibiotics. You should be replenishing your system, and your patients and family members and clients should be taking a probiotic. That's what a probiotic is. It's the healthy bacteria in capsule form, and you're replenishing your intestines so that your digestive capacity is supported. The most common culprits are cow's milk protein, casein and whey, and gluten. The other ones that are also, I'm sorry, is that a 5 or 5? Okay. Soy, corn, and eggs are also implicated. Now, the hard part is, even from the history, people may not know what triggers them. So the hard part is here's who I get to do this with. I see an adolescent and they're miserable and they've fallen out of their ability to live their life, and they have multiple symptoms. They've seen multiple doctors. They've gotten workups. All their doctors have said to them, you're not that sick. You're fine. Go back to school. And they know that something's wrong. If they're motivated, I will explain to them that if they were willing to do a 4-week trial where this is going to sound crazy, but they basically have to take out all gluten, dairy, corn, soy, and eggs, and processed foods from their diet for 4 weeks, which of course the patient looks at me like, you just named my diet. So the truth is, it's a super healthy anti-inflammatory diet. It's fruits and vegetables, lean meats, and non-gluten grains for 4 weeks. And I give them a pamphlet that has sample menus, sample recipes, a shopping list, websites. You won't believe how many websites, if any of you have not explored this world, it is unbelievable how many people have posted really useful information about the elimination diet and sample menus and recipes and how to live like this, at least for 4 weeks, at the end of which they then reintroduce each of these foods for every 2 days, and they notice which, if any, symptoms come back. And that's how they identify what food they're sensitive to. At the same time, I put them on fish oil, so about 1,000 milligrams once a day, a probiotic. They get their vitamin D checked. And if somebody has a story that I shared with, like the story I shared with you, their vitamin D is low. So then we check a vitamin D and we replenish their vitamin D, because that's being implicated in multiple systems, regulatory systems in the body, and has been associated with as being low in multiple chronic inflammatory conditions. And then a good old multivitamin, because I know they're using up all their micronutrients just to try to shut off the inflammation. So at the end of the 4 weeks, they're reintroducing the foods every 2 to 3 days. They're tracking symptoms, their headaches, their joint pain, insomnia, GI problems. Most of these kids either have constipation or diarrhea or intermittent, and no one's ever asked them about their bowel history. And when you ask them, or their doctors ask, they say, oh, it's normal. And I get really specific. I say, do you have daily formed stools? Are there times where you skip a day? Are there days where you go more than once, or it's soft or mushy and you don't know why because you're not sick? That's irritable bowel syndrome. That tells me you don't have enough good bacteria in your intestines. I'm starting you on a probiotic, and let's figure out if you have a food intolerance. If the food causes the symptoms, they need to remove it from their diet and keep it out of their diet. And if they're not feeling 100% better and this hasn't figured out what's going on, then we need to do further investigations. So food is information. Real food is medicine. Food is relationship. I mean, you know, the running on the go and not really sitting down and enjoying a meal, that's a whole topic unto itself. And mindful eating. Mindful eating, sitting down and eating, reduces stress. It improves digestion. Why? Because the blood flow goes to the place that it's supposed to. Increases our enjoyment of food, and it leads to consumption of fewer calories. And I think I'm just about out of time, but what I do have in the rest of your slides are very simple questions you can ask to screen people around their sleep and sleep pattern. And I've really written this in a lot of detail. With nutrition, I want to know, what is the breakfast, lunch, and dinner like? Asking about exercise, recreational activities. And then I covered with you the motivational interviewing skill and how I like to ask about that. And so the last few slides cover that we really, this is evidence-based. Motivation can be elicited by interpersonal interaction. If we ask open-ended questions and we ask patients what they know, it really helps them follow along and receive information. And that number 2 is really important. Ambivalence to change is true for all of us. And so it's the patient who needs to articulate the argument for change and the treatment plan, and we ask the open-ended questions. And so what I've done is I've then provided a slide for you with a little sample kind of talking points. What do you know about what causes depression? It sounds like you know a lot. There's some other information that might be useful for you. May I share that with you? What are your thoughts about that? How might you use that information? And is there anything else that would be relevant, that you think might be relevant for you? And you always want to ask them, what would you like to work on first? How would you like to do that? When would you like to come back and see me? Great. We'll work on this first based on what you were interested in, and then we'll work on the other pieces next. The take-home message, the mind is connected to the body. And we really leave this out in mental health. We just leave out the body. And as I've tried to share with you, it's integral in helping support the mind. And the last slide, if you're interested in learning about any of what I talked about in greater detail, the Ultramind Diet is by Mark Hyman, who's a family medicine doc who's trained in what's called functional medicine. And it's probably the best book I've seen that talks about the science and how to help people really understand improving moods and cognition in this more lifestyle approach. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.